Welcome to the 4th edition of Inside the Sports Car Paddock, our new weekly interview show complementing our long-standing Week in Sports Car show, which is strictly listener-driven with Q&A. So we're back for episode number 4 of Inside the Sports Car Paddock, presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers, with our friend Jeff Braun making us smarter, this time on a topic suggested on sports car dampers. So if you know a little bit about dampers, well, hopefully you're going to know a lot more by the time we're done here with this approximate half-hour conversation Jeff and I had over the weekend, trying to discuss both prototype damping and GT damping using the upcoming IMSA race at Sebring, as really the mechanism for us to explore the topic of what's allowed from a rules standpoint, what you're looking for from a damper build standpoint, ride characteristics, dealing with those crazy bumps, and Jeff has some really interesting insights here about Sebring's very curious track surface and how it affects damping mindsets. Then we move on to our pal Ben Keating, who's really become something of a great patron of the paddock. He's done it again by becoming the first person to gain access to a factory Ford GT. He'll be competing in the GTE-Am, the Pro-Am category at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, in his Keating Motorsports entry, using that beautiful Ford GT, first time in privateer hands. And then we move on to our third interview, and that's Bill Riley. Bill normally runs Ben in his full-time IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship GT Daytona program, and with that great association, Bill will now be running Ben's Ford GT at Le Mans. And owing to the long-standing family relationship between the Rileys and Ford, it's great to speak with Bill, find out more about this program, and also have him share some tales about what it'll be like being reunited with the Blue Oval in France. And then we close with our pal Katherine Legge, called in after a bit of flight drama getting home from her victory at the Mexico City, the Mexican Formula E round last weekend, where she and her teammate Brian Sellers were competing as part of the Jaguar I-PACE Electric Support Series. Great win for her. So it was really cool to learn a little bit more about the series just 2 rounds into its debut season. Also really cool to hear Katherine explain this career resurgence that she is having. And boy, is she going to have a busy year. Good for her, and especially adding a very impressive win last weekend in Mexico, only helping her cause. So, all right, let's get going with episode 4 of Inside the Sports Car Paddock, brought to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers. Starting off with our pal, race engineer for the Core Autosport Nissan on-road DPI team, Jeff Braun. How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks for calling. I'm glad you're feeling a little bit better. And just sitting here finishing up some stuff. We go to Sebring. I leave on Monday. We'll be testing for 2 days there with a bunch of other cars at Sebring, and just doing that while kind of cheering on my spotters who work for us at the 24 Hours, who are both Cup spotters. So watching the Cup race and getting ready for this test at Sebring.
Well, with you and so many others headed to Sebring, and Sebring being known as a circuit that places a higher demand on ride control, dampers, damping technology, can also not only reward those who build their dampers correctly, but also penalize those who maybe wander off into weird or strange areas. Thought that might be a really good place to start off this week, Jeff, of looking at the damper technology found across, say, all 4 classes in IMSA, 2 of those being Pro-Am, more don't touch it type mindsets with P2 and GT Daytona, maybe to a lesser degree, then also the 2 full Pro classes in DPI and GT Le Mans. Where do you want to start here, my friend, on explaining what's allowed and then also getting into what's needed across GT and prototypes at a place like Sebring?
Yeah, let's talk about, first of all, what we're legally allowed to do, which, you know, there was a time when there was no damper rules. People didn't really, sanctioning bodies didn't really understand that it was that important and that you could spend that much money doing it, and that quickly got out of control in the late 90s, early 2000s, and so rather than the history of it, let's talk about where we are right now. So in IMSA, as most people know, the cars are highly regulated, and that's all done through an homologation document. So in all 4 classes, a car has to be presented to either the FIA or IMSA or both, and in a spec that the manufacturer wants it to run. And then things are approved, disapproved, allowed, not allowed, and ultimately there's this 150-plus page homologation document, which spells out every detail of the car. The dampers is one of them. So in every class, once the manufacturer spells out a specific manufacturer of the damper, whether it be Penske, Öhlins, PKM, Dynamic, those dampers then must be run on the car. So you can't change from, I like Öhlins one week and the next week I want to run a Penske damper. You can't do that. You have to maintain that throughout the whole year. What you are allowed to do is change the internal components of the damper, pistons, valves, however the damper works, whether it's a shim damper or a shuttle valve, spool valve type damper. You're allowed to change those valves internally, which is a good thing because, especially at IMSA, we'll run Sebring, the super bumpy track. We'll go to Watkins Glen, which is billiard board smooth, and you'll need different internal configurations to make the car work well. But you're stuck or you're committed to that manufacturer of damper. So LMP2 is a cost-capped class, and so those dampers are a little less high-tech, a little less expensive, because they have to homologate the car to a price point. DPI is not that way. So all the DPI cars have more sophisticated, more adjustable, better, higher quality dampers than an LMP2 car. And really that same kind of differential plays out in the GT class too. DTLM is a higher end factory-based efforts. They have the high quality, super expensive trick dampers. GTD cars have to come to a cost and be serviceable for privateer teams and things like that, so their dampers are a little less sophisticated. So both prototype classes and both GT classes have a similar difference there. So that's what's allowed. One of the interesting things is in DPI specifically is Penske has there's Penske Dampers, which is a company that makes commercial shock absorbers for everything from motocross to four-wheelers to high-end race cars to snowmobiles. I mean, they're Penske dampers that's been around forever. And then Penske Racing, the race team itself, builds its own dampers, and you know more about this than me.
And those are readily available to whoever asks for them, right, Jeff?
Absolutely not. That's the thing. I mean, their IndyCar, they do that for their IndyCar program. They build their own dampers, and I don't mean just like a few parts. They manufacture everything, and it's completely independent from Penske Racing Shocks, the company that we've all known for years and years. So those Penske Racing dampers are on the IndyCars that Team Penske runs, and also on the Acura DPIs. That's a massively intensive program, from what I understand, and it pays off. I mean, it's probably one of the big areas that's still open to some development. Inside that damper, that's open to anybody. There are some limitations from the IndyCar to the sports car thing. Sports cars specifically do not allow a inerter technology, which the IndyCar series does allow, and that just drives the cost way up. Makes you go faster, makes more grip. It's a great technology, but it drives the cost way up. So sports cars, you're not allowed to use inerters in sports cars. But still, still the level of sophistication in the DPI dampers is pretty high. I can tell you, it's not a big secret, the front dampers on our Nissan Legge are special dampers made by Öhlins just for this car because they had to be fit in the package properly. And it has a lot of it's a tiny little, looks like a F1 type of damper, just to be able to package it properly. So that's the kind of thing we're talking. Penske Racing is building their own shocks in Mooresville for their cars, and Dynamic Shocks is owned by Multimatic, which builds the Mazdas. So they have specific dampers, specific just to the Mazdas, and that's a company that builds F1 dampers for a couple Formula One teams. There's some pretty trick stuff going on there. It just looks like a normal damper on the outside, but inside there's some pretty good stuff.
And so if you look at this dynamic, and apologies to use dynamic, but if you look at this dynamic, Jeff, you have two classes where very heavy options exist to tune and refine a chassis to the circuits that we head to with a more open policy of what you can do internally. And you have the other two where you aren't nearly as free to do so, and as a result, while you can get things close, you probably are not going to be able to deliver your drivers that perfect feeling that you are hoping to give them, that perfect balance that they need to go out and attack. Let's come back to Sebring and knowing what you would be looking for. Instead of going through all four classes, I think let's just limit ourselves to both GT ride control and prototype DPI ride control. What are you looking for in, let's start with the prototype end. What are you looking for at Sebring in terms of ride control and damping, knowing that you're probably going to have to deal with some ride heights that are a little higher than, say, optimal due to the big bumps and the bounding that happens there, and also share some thoughts about the other suspension components that interact with the dampers to control the aerodynamic platform, to cover roll and squat and all kinds of good stuff. Why don't we open that door up first?
Yeah, so Sebring is tough because of the bumps. Everybody knows it's bumpy, but what's interesting for a race engineer, a vehicle dynamicist, all of our simulation stuff is the kind of bumps that Sebring has. Because it's an old airport, the way they built it is they built it with concrete blocks, and those blocks are I don't know how big, but anyway, they're big, maybe 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot squares that they kind of put together, and there's seams at each one of those squares. And so you end up with those blocks over the years have kind of moved. They've shifted up or down based on the heat and the water and all of that, so the blocks aren't all level. So when you go down the straightaway, you might have the right front on one of those blocks that might be higher than where the left front tire is, and the right rear might be in another block that's a little lower. So you get this, it's not a bump like you would get in a normal track that goes across the track, like a braking bump that you get, or just one pothole, or you get these various level blocks that you're running over, and it can get so bad that if your damping isn't right, I mean, the driver can barely drive it down the straightaway because you get the right front driven up when it hits a block, the left front's driven down, then, 15 feet later, it's opposite, and you can barely drive in a straight line if you get it wrong. So the damping becomes really, really tricky to get that right. Turn 17 is one of the, if anybody's going to be at Sebring, try to go watch in Turn 17. It's hard, but Turn 1 is also another good one. Super bumpy, super fast, and the bumps are what I call crosstalk. It talks across the car. So know, what happens is you hit a bump with the inside tire, and it immediately influences the outside tire. Because we have anti-roll bars connecting them, when you move one tire, the anti-roll bar is trying to move the other tire, and the dampers actually are tuned so that it works well with the spring rates we have, the anti-roll bar rates we have, the aerodynamics, because it all has to work together, because you're not just trying to control the one wheel that damper is connected to. It influences the other side, and it even influences the opposite axle on the crosswise. When we go to a shaker rig, not to get too in-depth here, but one of the biggest things that you're looking for on a shaker rig to make grip is a thing called contact patch load variation. And everybody knows what the contact patch is. That's where the rubber meets the road, literally. And the load on that contact patch, what we're trying to do is limit the variation of that load. We don't want it to go low, where it's almost off the ground, and then real high, and then low and high, and low and high. Because the driver doesn't know what's going on. It makes the car feel really bad to the driver. So we're looking to limit that contact patch load variation. And that's what the dampers do, but not independently. They have to work with the anti-roll bar stiffness, the springs, the aerodynamics, all to try to minimize that contact patch load variation. And Sebring is just super unique. It's hard. It's not at all like Long Beach, which is, people will say, Long Beach, very bumpy, but completely different than how the bumps are at Sebring.
So those bumps at a place like Long Beach, they are almost like, I guess, regular speed bumps. If you think of them in that terms, they tend to be somewhat linear, and if it's not an actual bump, meaning a raised portion of the track, then it's a dip in the track, but it's fairly rare when you have, say, just one side of the car being affected by things and not the entire car over that type of dynamic, if we're talking there.
Exactly.
So
exactly. It's kind of like the Long Beach ones are kind of like, or most tracks are almost like braking bumps, like if you watch a supercross race and you see the rolling kind of bumps that start to develop in the dirt on the entry to corners. Those are the kind of, so they go across the track, and you'll generally hit them with one axle. Now, curbs we consider curbs a bump, and that's a whole nother topic for how we use the dampers to allow us to run the curbs good, because if we can run an apex curb and somebody else can't, we've effectively made our corner easier to get around and made our track shorter. So running the curbs is another super important thing that we tune our dampers to be able to do, but that's not what we're talking about here at Sebring. Although we need to run curbs at Sebring too, but if you can get it over the normal track, it's going to be fine in the curbs.
So let's talk a bit about how you would want to build the internals of a damper, knowing that most of our listeners have never seen the inside of a damper, much less would know what you would want to do inside of them. But knowing that you, sitting at home in Texas right now, could be building dampers for Sebring to affect the kind of handling that you wanted from the car, without getting too high level, what are the general kind of things you would want to do in a prototype that would allow the car to handle bumps without being so soft that, it's just flopping up and down like, a 1960s Cadillac, or vice versa, being so stiff that for the places that aren't bumpy, where you want to go quickly around a corner and make maximum speed, would send you shooting into outer space the moment you hit a bump.
Right. Well, so I'll try to keep this. Let's talk about one area that we could use. Most modern prototype dampers have 5 adjustments, and quickly there's a low speed and a high speed bump adjustment, which means when the tire is going up, we can adjust the force that the damper produces when the tire hits a bump and goes up in quickly. Then there's high-speed and low-speed rebound adjustment, which is when the tire comes back down and what the force it produces. And then there's a fifth adjustment called the blow-off, which, let's talk about that because that's important for Sebring. The blow-off is like a pressure relief valve, basically. So let's say we're going down the straightaway at Sebring, and one of these concrete blocks is up a half an inch over the other one, and we're going 180 miles an hour, and we hit that block. Well, that's going to drive the tire up in bump. The damper is connected to the suspension, between the suspension and the chassis. It's going to start to go into bump, which is compression, or get shorter. So the damper is driven very quickly because we've hit this bump really hard. The suspension reacts immediately. The damper gets compressed very quickly, and the damper moves fast. I'm not talking about the speed of the car, although that is fast at this point in our example, but the damper moves fast because, bam, the suspension gets hit, the damper gets compressed really fast, and a damper makes force by how fast the damper is moving. So the faster you move it, the more force there is. And most people kind of get that concept. They've held a shock absorber maybe or seen it, and they've pressed it together. And if you press it slow, it moves pretty easily. If you try to press it really fast, it moves really hard.
A lot more resistance.
Right. So it's velocity sensitive. It makes more force the faster you move it. So we hit this big bump, wham, the damper gets smashed together. The force goes way up. And so what happens is it basically locks the suspension, right? Because the damper's not moving very easily. So the suspension becomes solid when we hit this bump. And now the tire starts to flex, or the tire just comes off the ground because we have no suspension. We've essentially lost all of our suspension because the damper is hydraulically locked is the best way of looking at it. It's just, you can't move the thing that fast and still get some movement because you're moving it so fast the hydraulic fluid can't move through the little orifices fast enough, and you've essentially locked up that damper. So what we have for Sebring and most tracks, but for Sebring, is we have a blow-off, which is just a pressure relief valve that allows the fluid, when it gets to a certain pressure, to suddenly bypass around the shock and let the damper move. So, and absorb the bump. You can picture this kind of in your mind if you've watched a rally car go off of a jump. I mean, it hits the jump, and you can see there's some movement, and when it lands, and then it kind of soaks it up. And that's basically what we're trying to do with this pressure relief or blow-off valve in our dampers at Sebring. So we have good, normal kind of damping like we would have that control the car very nicely when we're cornering and braking. But when we hit this big bump and the pressure builds up and the damper locks up and makes our car so rigid that the car bounces off the road, instead of allowing that, the pressure relief valve opens up, shock becomes softer on those real fast, hard bumps and soaks it up.
Let's cover one more thing on the prototype damping picture here for Sebring, Jeff, before moving over to GT. With prototypes, we obviously have a creature that is far more aerodynamically dependent for its performance. You want to maintain stability and consistency with the floor, for example. I mean, with all aerodynamic surfaces, but you are making more efficient downforce. You're making more downforce in general if the bottom of the car is running as intended at its intended ride heights and is as level as can be, both laterally and longitudinally. But then again, you have all of these surface variables that in many instances prevent you from having that, as he mentioned, Watkins Glen, that billiard table smoothness that just allows peak downforce to be generated almost the entire time, because you don't have bumps and all kinds of stuff the dampers are having to control, and the bottom of the car just tipping all over the place. What do you do? How close can you get to, I don't want to say optimal aero performance? Is there a mindset you take to building dampers that keeps a place like Sebring in mind, where you might never be truly satisfied in that department?
For sure. I mean, it's a huge compromise. Taking the opposite extreme like you talked about Watkins Glen, there's still some compromises, but much less compromises. At Sebring, turn 17 and turn 1, the last corner and the first corner are great examples. They're both very fast corners where you want your perfect aerodynamics. You want the most downforce, and you want that downforce to be, again, it's almost more important that the downforce is consistent, that the amount on the front and rear, that balance, it's determined by what we call the center of pressure, but that the balance between the front and rear downforce doesn't change from the entry of the corner to the exit of the corner, because if it does, the driver has a different handling characteristic. So we're looking for very consistent aerodynamic balance throughout a high-speed corner. The problem with Sebring is when the car is bouncing around and the front of the car is bouncing up and down and the rear of the car is bouncing up and down, the ride height, the distance between the bottom of your floor, which is really an underwing, and the ground changes. So your downforce is changing quite a bit through that whole time. And it makes the car not only difficult to drive from the tires bouncing on the road, but from the aerodynamics changing massively foot by foot during the corner. So the driver, a lot of the inputs you'll see the driver giving, you'll think, oh boy, that's because it's so bumpy. A lot of it's because, yes, it's bumpy, but it's because the aerodynamic feel of the car is changing so rapidly through the corner.
The effects of the bumps are manipulating the aerodynamics to the point to where you might be turning in and having a car that's neutral based on the bump that you hit and what it does to the bottom of the car and how that affects your downforce. You could have, say, understeer as you lose some front downforce, and as the car comes back down and settles and the rear travels over that bump and bounces the rear up, you could then go to oversteer as you lose rear downforce. So the bump, yes, the bumps are the culprit, but you actually have aerodynamic physics are the things that are really causing more of the driver to have really fast hands to stay on top of this thing that's handling 3 or 4 different ways in a single corner.
Exactly. I mean, you can, the front of the car, for instance, I mean, you can, and they actually go, the bumps and the aerodynamics can actually work in concert against you. So picture you're going down, you're turning into turn 1, the car hits a bump, the front of the car goes up. Well, aerodynamically, when the car goes up, you have less downforce. Mechanically, when the car goes up, the front tires have gotten lighter. You have less grip. Okay. Now, you turn into the corner right when that happens, and you start to have a little angle toward the apex, and suddenly the car comes crashing down because the bump's over. Or maybe there's a dip. The next concrete block's a little lower, and you've dipped into this. Now the front of the car comes crashing down. The outside tire gets hammered into the road, picks up tons of mechanical grip. At the same time, your floor of your car, your splitter, is now close to the ground. So it's making super big downforce. So it sucks down, and the outside front tire makes grip, and you spin out. Simple as that. And you really haven't done anything except drive through the corner. All you're doing is driving along. So it's really tough on the drivers. It's a compromise, and we haven't even gotten into another huge factor that dampers affect is tire life, tire longevity. We're tuning them to try to also not abuse the tires and make grip the best way we can so that we have good tires at the end of a tire stint. So dampers are really super critical, and all that we just talked about really applies to a GT car too. It's amazing you take a GTLM or even a current GTD car, GT3, how aerodynamically dependent those cars are, don't kid yourself. That it's pretty critical for those cars too. They're making a lot of downforce.
And also knowing that they happen to rely on mechanical grip more than any of the other machines competing in the WeatherTech Championship. If we use turn 17 again at Sebring, Jeff, you'll see just about every car lift the right front wheel at some point going over some of the bouncier curbs. Bouncier bumps and whatnot. But you'll definitely see that more consistently, and also the highest leaning, the highest pogoing with GT cars. Share some thoughts on damping mindset that you would have, whether it was the Porsche 911 GT3R you ran not too long ago, or otherwise, of how, even though modern GT cars are indeed making more downforce than ever, you still have a considerable amount of weight to control through damping, that mass as well, and ride height as well. You're not necessarily going to be as low as a prototype. I mean, there's a lot of things that you are trying to get those dampers to do that it almost seems like an impossible task when you get to this lovely circuit.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Oh, let's take GTD, for example. Those cars are a little more restricted on their suspension geometry designs. While they're racing designs for sure, the amount of latitude they have with where they can move their pickup points from where the standard stock production-based car is, they're a little more tightly confined. So that's the best way of saying that the geometries aren't ideal for a racing car on the GTD cars, GT3 cars. So some of the problem you have with Sebring is that you need to let the dampers be softer, have the blow-off in them, let the suspension move to absorb the bumps. But then you get into some geometry positions that the car doesn't really operate very well in. Your camber's not right, your roll center's in the wrong spot because you've allowed the suspension to move so much that you end up in some less than ideal situations from a geometry standpoint. So you can restrict that on a smoother track because you run stiffer springs and stiffer dampers, and you just don't let the suspension get into those non-ideal ranges. On a GTLM car, they're a little bit more, the suspension is a little bit better due to the rules, and you don't have near as much of a problem there. The interesting thing that they have is they have better tire choice. They'll be allowed 2, sometimes 3 compounds, a soft, a medium, and a hard, or sometimes just 2. So they can make a little more grip directly with the tire than the other cars can. And it makes, in the bumps, you'll see GTLM cars at Sebring, their braking capacity is fantastic. I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion that if you're 2 or 3 car lengths back with a prototype, that you can outbrake a GTLM car into turn 7, for instance, or turn 13 at Sebring. Those cars stop really well. GTD cars now stop really well with the ABS, which is a big advantage on a bumpy track because it will keep you from locking one tire over the other as you're going over the bumps, and that contact patch load variation we talked about is changing, and you're getting grip, no grip, grip, no grip from your front tires. ABS helps that. So the GT cars have it's a little different set of parameters that they're trying to come up against,
sure,
or that they are up against, but solved pretty much the same way as the prototypes.
Well, Mr. Braun, we have, I think, given folks a lot to digest here in almost a 30-minute conversation on dampers. Makes me think we should save some of the other fun stuff we had on sports car radios, qualifying setups versus race setups, and other great topic suggestions that have come in why don't we save some of those next week, and maybe we'll fit more topics into our call that are just a little bit shorter examples. But as always, my friend, this is the fun part, and I love opening the show with this. And folks, obviously, if they're more fans of just the conversational, topical things, well, we also have the other guests that are on each week too. But as a once upon a time race engineer who found out he was much better, I think, with a keyboard in his hand, it's always fun to open the show talking with a supreme race engineer who makes all of us smarter. So thank you again, my friend.
Thanks, Marshall. I appreciate it. I feel like we've packed we could probably do about 300 hours of damper talk into 30 minutes, but hopefully we get some of the general stuff and people get an appreciation when they go watch these cars bouncing around at Sebring. I'm going to go try next week to try to make mine not bounce around. We can talk about how I did when we talk again next weekend.
Sounds like a plan. Ben Keating, welcome to Inside the Sports Car Paddock. I have been looking forward to catching up with you, knowing that you have headed east to Le Mans and competed in GT cars. You've been there in a prototype. You're now heading there in a car that I can tell you, I've been saving my money to try and get a hold of a Ford GT. The fact that you are going to be the first, call it privateer, independent person competing in one of the new Ford GT chassis, hopefully in the GTE-Am class. Let's just start off on where this conversation started, who it started with, because I think you might be opening a door here that a lot of folks want to walk through.
I think that's true. I didn't think about this until just now when you started talking, but I was the first person to bring out the Viper GT3 car. I was the first participant in the AMG GT3 in the U.S., and now I get to do another first. It started, I would say it started back at Petite in 2017.
Wow.
Because most people don't know, I've been enjoying watching on social media how everyone views me as a Mopar guy because of my Viper history. But the fact is, my grandfather was a Ford dealer, and he had 5 kids, and 4 of them became Ford dealers. One of those is my father.
Wow.
So I grew up in the Ford business, and my first dealership, 17 years ago when I got started on my own, I bought a little bitty Ford store in Port Lavaca, Texas, and I've got deep Ford roots. And so when I won the Aiken Award in 2017, it was looking at, I did not have a very good experience in LMP2 at Le Mans. I knew I wanted to go back into GT-Am. And I think the spirit of the Bob Aiken Award is that the winner goes in GT-Am. And so I was really looking for what AmCar options were for 2018 Le Mans. And the options are extremely limited. They were extremely limited. There were a couple of Astons, but everything else was Porsche or Ferrari. And it just so, I went and the fact is I met with Ford and I met with Corvette, and I met with everybody that could have had a potential option of entering a car. I really wanted to race something I sell, but as it worked out, it just made sense for me to team up with Reese and run the Ferrari. But that's what started the conversation. And I think that throughout the year of 2018, there are just so many different things that came together to make this deal happen. But one of which is that, I think Ford needed to get comfortable with me, and they needed to make sure that that I was going to represent them well, I guess. Sure. I would say,
Sure.
And so it's been great.
So how do those, and again, I'm not asking you to tell us anything you shouldn't, but how do those conversations get started beyond just a formal inquiry? And I ask because, when I think of this factory Ford GT project, I'm sure they've received numerous inquiries. They've so far stayed very close to the vest, kept it as just purely a factory deal, either run in Europe through Multimatic, run here in the U.S. with Chip Ganassi Racing, and Multimatic obviously involved there. But opening the books, per se, hasn't been so much of a call so far. How do you start to get them comfortable, and who says, all right, Ben, let's do this?
Well, I think it has less to me and more to do with them. And I guess I should say, I'll tell you what my perception is, but I'm talking about what I think, not what I know. And I guess it's important to point that out. But from my perception, Ford this is a big program. They're a big company, and they plan these things really far out, and they put a plan together and they try to operate at the highest level possible. And the competition in GTLM is extremely close competition, extremely difficult. And you got to be on your toes. You got to bring your A game to that deal. And so, my perception is that while the ACO is probably saying, "Hey, we'd really love for you to have an AM car," I don't think Ford, built additional cars with the idea of running AM. And when it comes to engineering or engine support from Roush Yates or all the other various complicated things it takes to run a successful program, I think it was easier just to say we need to focus on our GT Pro LM program because we don't want any other effort to sidetrack us from our main goal. But so that's my opinion from Ford's standpoint, and I think really that's what it's about. I think this is mostly, it's no secret that they're planning or programming their effort is scheduled to end at the end of this 2019 season.
Yeah.
And again, my perception is that now they're looking out and saying, okay, what does it look like beyond 2019? How can we, what are we going to do with these assets, and what are we, how are we going to represent the car beyond this, and when can that start? There are a lot of people that have to be comfortable with each other, and I think clearly, Ganassi is comfortable with Riley. Riley is comfortable with Ganassi or Multimatic or Ford, and there are just all these different pieces of the puzzle that came together to say, okay, Keating Motorsports can buy a car and run a car at Le Mans with our extremely low level of you can't take away anything from our pro effort, but we'll help you as much as we can, which is a big deal because the fact is that they've run 4 different cars at Le Mans for the last 3 years, and theoretically, there shouldn't be much for us to do other than drive the car.
Yeah.
They know how to dial a car in there, and we will be there at the same time as their other pro cars. And so, we're expecting them to tell us what to do, and then we'll do it.
So you've already mentioned a bit the next question I was going to get into, because keeping in mind that maybe not everybody has read the press release and such, or seen the entry list revealed, but tell us a little bit about who will be running the car, what kind of team will be in and around this, and I also would say that has to be a big part of your comfort zone too.
Well, sure. I mean, it's no small feat to run a car at Le Mans on the other side of the pond. It takes a lot of coordinating, a lot of effort, and my feeling is that running any car in a 24-hour race is risky because every car is a long shot. I think of all the times where I've put together a really, really strong program, and you never know what's going to happen. So it is important to be comfortable, and Keating Motorsports is the entry, as it has been for the last 3 years at Le Mans, and as it has been, except last year with Reese, that was all kind of Reese's people, but there are a lot of people that would enjoy being part of this program, and I can lean on Riley Motorsports and hire a bunch of people from that I'm comfortable with from my IMSA program, and I can lean a little bit on Ganassi and their experience with having some people who are familiar with the car, and I mean it's I hate to call it a hodgepodge because that makes it sound less professional than it is, but it's going to be a perfect synergistic group of guys that are going to do a great job.
We've got the word synergy in there. That's all that matters.
Exactly.
So,
yes.
So Ben, you mentioned gaining access or buying the car. I mean, what's the, not asking you to commit to any long-term whatever, but just curious, as you look to Le Mans and look to what you might do afterwards. Obviously, you have this beautiful WINS-sponsored Mercedes-AMG GT3 that you're using to go for the IMSA GT Daytona Championship, but what do you have maybe as just a goal or aspiration, or what might be there for this Ford once you're done with France?
Yeah, it's interesting. That is one of the top questions that I receive, and a lot of people asking again on social media about that type of stuff, and my answer is baby steps. My answer is that it is impossible for me to explain how complicated and difficult it has been. It's been great work. It's been exciting, but it is just amazing how this whole program has come together. And it's not just a simple, hey, let's go, run a Ford GT at Le Mans. And we are still very young in this effort. Even though we've announced it, there's a lot left to do. And so, right now, I'm not looking any further beyond Le Mans. I will run. My guess is what I'm currently planning is I'll run 13 races this year, personally. And the fact is that this is my hobby. I've got businesses to tend to, and I've got a family that likes to spend time with me occasionally. That's a lot. I'm out of town, racing 25% of my year, and I have a hard time thinking about what's next for the Ford GT. Although it is extremely exciting to know that, okay, now not only do I own the car, but I'm going to own, 10 sets of wheels and spare body work, and I'm going to own everything I need to go out and run an endurance race. And
the potential is there for whatever you may or may not choose to do. At least you have the potential sitting there in the on the shop floor.
Exactly, and I would be. I don't want to throw out any false expectations, but it would be exciting to run it again. I'm not ready to look at what that would look like.
Well, let's close on, and that's a perfect segue. I love you, Ben Keating. Speaking of what it might look like, on the most recent episode of our Week in Sports Cars podcast, I did say, although I don't believe there's been any indication of what this beautiful Keating Ford GT would look like, having seen the Wins color on your Mercedes AMG GT3, just know that there's some of us who would dream to see those colors applied to a Ford GT at Le Mans. So, not tipping any hands or whatever. Just saying, boy, that'd be a beautiful sight.
Well, that is an interesting thought. I'll say that we're still working on liveries. I've had some volunteers of people who said, "Hey, man, let me put something together," and my answer is great. I'd love to see anybody's thoughts on what that looks like. I have created or asked for 4 different ideas, and we're all going to sit down and see what we think looks best. I hope to, or I want to, kind of tie into the Ford, not only the Ford history, but also the Ford Pro cars. I think there's something really special about being the first GT-Am, the first privateer in the car, and there's something special about being able to go behind the curtain and be part of a Chip Ganassi Racing team, or this GTLM Pro team, and kind of being one of the Ford teams is special, and I'm hoping to be able to tie that in terms of a livery. But even though I am clearly one of the Ford teams, that doesn't mean I get an early look at what the Ford liveries are going to be either. So I want to kind of wait and see what they do, and see if I can play off that, and hopefully we can come up with something that they're excited about as well.
Well, I can't wait to see it, Ben, knowing that this is the 50th anniversary of the final win there for the Ford GT40s back in the day. I've heard some pretty cool stuff about, on the factory side at least, some throwback liveries honoring that 50-year achievement. So regardless, can't wait to see what you come up with. And as you mentioned at the outset here, I also continue to appreciate the fact, Ben, that rather than just saying, okay, I want to do this thing in motor racing, what can I go get that's just a tool that everyone else uses, you are also driven to try and be a little bit different, to achieve the same outcome of wins and championships and otherwise, but definitely by applying less of a follower mindset and more of trying to be a leader, of being distinct. And that, to me, just fits. It's a perfect fit for what sports car racing is all about.
Well, thank you, Marshall. It definitely feels that way, but that's what makes it fun for me. I mean, I am, like I said, I've got 3 Ford dealerships, and some of it is racing history, some of it is Ford history, but it feels like a race win to be able to do the program to begin with. It's really special to do this thing, and that is not lost on me by any means. It is. I'm kind of humbled by it. I mean, I feel like it's a big weight on my shoulders, but that's also what makes it exciting. And every year I feel like, oh man, I'm not going to be able to top this one. This kind of just feels like I've done it again. Once again, I'm saying, man, there's no way I'll ever top this one. So we'll see.
Well, we'll go ahead and announce your 2020 McLaren Senna GTE-Am entry. Right? Well, no, we'll keep that one under wraps for now, Ben. But thanks as always for taking time, my friend, and so happy that you've got this
announce
going.
I don't know, some kind of a hypercar.
Yep.
I'll be going for overall wins at Le Mans next.
Yep, you and your Bugatti Veyron.
Exactly.
GTE-Am coming to Le Mans next year. I love it. All right. Well, thanks again, my friend. Bill Riley, I am so happy to hear that not only are you heading back to Le Mans, you're heading back. We'll be putting your good hands and putting a lot of talent into a certain blue oval Ford GT, Keating Motorsports. Man, tell me about this, knowing you've been there many times, you've done so many things, but I have to imagine between yourself, your good pal, Ben Keating, plus this brand, there's a lot packed in here for the Riley family.
Oh, for sure. I mean, when you look at, all the players that we have involved in it, you have, obviously, going back with Ben Keating is a great thing to do, and going back with Ford, it's kind of I don't want to say a dream, but I was a Ford kid. My dad worked at Ford when I grew up in Detroit, and when you grew up in Detroit, you were either a Ford kid or a Chrysler kid or a GM kid, and I was a Ford kid, and I was born in Dearborn, Michigan. So it's kind of a lot for me to come back, and then on top of that, we have Chip Ganassi Racing and all the great people there helping us out to make sure that we're as competitive as we can be right off the bat.
So, knowing that this is, for now, a one-off, in and among your full-time WeatherTech Sports Car Championship effort with Ben and the glorious Wins-sponsored Mercedes-AMG GT3, I mean, knowing the way you like to do business, obviously, Bill, you're going to want to get as many miles as you can with that Ford and get your entire team up to speed. Just share some thoughts on, I guess, achieving comfort zones with a car that's going to be new to you, knowing that you would have the test day, the Le Mans official test day, and then in theory head right into the race unless you have some other tests lined up beforehand.
Well, actually, we're going to go to Sebring on Tuesday with the car. Chip Ganassi Racing is going to run the test, and we're going to observe. And I think that my comfort level is high with this program just because of our relationship with Chip Ganassi Racing and how much support they're going to be giving us. I think we'll probably be hopefully garage next to them. And, I've worked with them so long with the Daytona prototype, and Chip and my father worked together, in the 70s and early 80s when Chip drove Super V. So, I mean, there's a lot of history there and a lot of trust. And when, if they tell me that, for this condition, you should do X, Y, and Z, and that's what we're going to do. So I think that's what makes it really kind of the icing on the cake is the relationship with them.
So one of the things in speaking with Ben, he mentioned, obviously a lot of folks have said, oh, wow, okay, so tell us about the big plans, right? So this must mean you're going to do all kinds of stuff in the future. And he said, look, we're just trying to do the one race at this point. We're not getting that far ahead of ourselves. What's your mindset coming in from a, I guess, procedural standpoint? learning the ins and outs of the car, your crew, obviously getting to know the car. I mean, are you looking at this Le Mans event from I don't know if I want to say a one-off mindset, but are you looking at it from a let's just go do Le Mans and everything else is a question mark, or is it let's do our best to master this machine so that if and when we might run this again sometime, we really do feel like we've gotten to a place where we're very comfortable?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, obviously Le Mans is going to be, if we have a solid Le Mans and Ben wants to do other things in the future, obviously this gives it a pretty easy way to go do those things. But at the same time, my goal with Ben Keating is to win the WeatherTech Championship in GTD with a 33 wins car, and that's my goal for Ben Keating this year, or for that program. So I'm staying fairly focused on that, and and obviously if we have a good Le Mans and it's clean and the car performs how we all expect it to, and then that opens up Ben for other things in the future. But him and I have not really talked too much about what that would be or look like.
Another thing that might be of interest to hear a little bit about, or at least as you're preparing for this trip to France, this will be the first time the Ford GT has run in the Am category. Share some thoughts on that, Bill. The fact that while it's not a new car to the FIA, WEC, or ACO and GTE Pro configuration, I don't know if I want to say guinea pigs, but you guys will certainly be doing something brand new that hasn't been done with this car in one specific class. How do you go about that? Is that a lot of paperwork? Is that something smoothed out by some of the partners you'll be working with?
I think a lot of that was smoothed out by Ford. I put in the entry for Keating Motorsports just like I would anything else, and when you click on the GTE-Am entry tab, one of the pull downs was a Ford GT. So it was already in there as a car that was allowed an Am. It's just Ben is the first one to capitalize on that. And performance wise, it'll all depend on how we do with how the BOP is set and so forth. But I think the ACO is, at least they're extremely familiar with the car, unlike, let's say, the Viper program, where it was kind of a bit of a one-off to them and they had to be very cautious. But they have so much data on the Ford GT from the WEC that they should be able to have a pretty solid BOP with it right off the bat.
Another thing too, and this is all just looking to the future a little bit, knowing that at least how Ford partner Michelin works with the team and all the other factory teams in GTE Pro, things in GTE-Am a little bit different from a tire model and whatnot, not necessarily the private supply, if you want to call it that. Can you share some thoughts on how you plan on working with Michelin to possibly use a tire that's somewhat new to the chassis? Not, again, same brand, but there should be some variances.
I think it's going to be very similar. I think the tire will be very similar to what they use on the Pro car. And obviously Michelin, we've had a long and extremely good history with Michelin. So going back with them, that really feels smooth and at home, and a lot of trust there also. But I don't think there's a lot of difference between the Pro tire and the Am tire. Well,
that'll hopefully make things a little easier from an integration standpoint. Let's close on this, Bill, and this is the part that makes me smile. So a couple years ago, you said, hey, was digging around the office or whatever and found an old videotape of 1983 Road America IMSA race where the front-engine Ford Mustang GTP car won that my dad designed. And there's so much Riley and Ford history. What comes to mind here, my friend, knowing that you are going to get to add another chapter to that legacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, typically, I get a little bit jittery when the first practice starts and the car rolls out of the pit box, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about that when that happens. And it's kind of cool also is we actually have a Mustang GTP car in our shop now that we're looking at doing a restoration on. So it's pretty cool. Obviously we found that video, got it to you. we found the Mustang, or a Mustang came to us, so we have a Mustang that we're looking at now, which is obviously really cool. And then then obviously my father's history with Carcraft and the Ford GT at Le Mans, that's another bit of icing on the cake. Then we have all the other work that that we did with Robert Yates Racing when he was running the Thunderbirds with Davey and Ernie. I mean, there's so much Ford history deep in our family that this is kind of it's nice to see how it'll all continue on.
Yeah, especially looking at the fact that we're at that final 50th anniversary for GT40 win. Yeah, man, this again, if someone was writing the script, this one certainly fits it perfectly. Well, I can't wait to see the car debuted publicly, see how it is presented, what colors happen to be on it, and so on. So, really happy for you, happy for Ben, and just love this all-American continuation of the program in GTE-Am, knowing that first privateer hands are going to be running one of these Multimatic built beasts.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be easy, that's for sure. We're going to have to do our homework. We're going to be in the sim tomorrow to work on it before we go to Sebring. But with Ganassi helping us and with Ford behind us, and obviously with Ben and Jerome and Felipe Faraga's driving, we're looking pretty strong, and it all feels right now.
Katherine Legge, nothing like jumping on a plane as the winner of an international motor race. As someone who I know loves ripping around in your, mini SUV, I don't know how to describe this other than have you put good use to work at home into your getting your victory last weekend, or I don't know. And I'm not sure how many folks know that much about winning in this fine Jaguar utility electric vehicle in Mexico City. So why don't you just catch us up a little bit on the series, and then we can talk about your cool win.
Thank you. I didn't actually know it was like a mini SUV or a utility vehicle until you just said, but it makes sense. It kind of looks a little bit like a crossover. Obviously, it's based on the I-PACE that you can actually buy and drive on the roads, and it's fully electric. The battery is basically the whole length of the car underneath, so the center of gravity is very low. It's heavy, but it's put in a good place. So it accelerates really, really well. There's 100% torque available straight away, so it will get up to 100 miles an hour really fast. The top speed obviously isn't as fast as, say, the IMSA cars or an open wheel car or anything like that. But it's not designed to be, because if you remember back to the early days of Formula E, those cars took a while to develop and get faster as well, and they're leaving a lot in the tank. So, for example, in Mexico, I still had 38% of battery left after the race.
Wow.
So I could have maybe turned the regen off, or they could do a longer race, so they could give us more power. So it's really kind of early days, see where we are, see what we've got, and then we'll make it faster and everything, just like Formula E did, and now look at that series. It's kind of really exploded and taken off, and all the manufacturers want to be a part of it. So I think Jaguar were really smart getting in there early and showcasing this really cool car that you can actually drive on the streets. And it's just really cool to drive because it is heavy. You're on street tires, so it's a different art form. It is all city street races, which I love. Detroit, Long Beach, those kind of places I've kind of found a home on. And so to take this all over the world on street courses is also very neat. And it makes me a better driver. It makes, Brian and I work really well together. My teammate, Brian Sellers, we fought each other for the championship in IMSA last year, and now we're fighting each other in this I-PACE eTrophy. It's a really cool other feather to your bow. And I'm enjoying it, which is the main thing, right?
And that's the thing that I've appreciated with this. When it was announced, what was it, Petit Le Mans last year, something around that timeline, I just thought how interesting knowing that you've had this really cool, I don't know if I want to call it a career renaissance, Kat, but it just seems like in the last couple of years, any of the instability you've had and not being able to find something that was either permanent or just that you could really dig into and know that it was going to be there for you year after year. Seems like you've had that. This has been growing with the Meyershank racing team, and now your ability to add in something like this Jaguar I-PACE eTrophy program with the Rahal Letterman Lanigan team just seems like yet more confirmation that your skills, your talents, and your career are just continuing to head on an upward arc where, admittedly for some folks who have as many years in the game as you do, that's not always the case. Are you seeing that? Are you feeling that?
Yeah, I think you make a good point, actually, Marshall. It's been interesting to me. I feel like I have got better as a driver, for sure, but I also feel like I don't know whether people knew where to place me, because I've been driving, I drove the Lotus for Dragon in IndyCar, and I think a lot of people wrote me off after that. And they didn't really understand the situation or the circumstances. And then I drove the Delta Wing, which will be eternally grateful to Dr. Panos for giving me that opportunity. And it was really fun. And I got to develop developing the car. I learned a lot about car setup and engineering and everything else from that. So it may have been a weird situation to be in where people can't really judge how good or not you are. But for me, it was a good learning process and a good opportunity. And then for sure, I'll be really, really eternally grateful to Mike and to Bobby for believing in me and giving me these opportunities, because, with Mike now, it's year 3, and we've kind of come into a rhythm and come into our own in terms of the relationship we have with each other as well, and that the trust that you build. And, we went through some sticky patches where I don't think he knew whether I would adapt to the GT car or not, and we're all under a lot of pressure, and I feel like I've stepped up, and I feel like I'm doing a good job. And then for Bobby to give me this opportunity over everybody else, he could have picked a number of different people for that, and he picked me. So I want to repay that faith that he's shown in me too. And I think they're both giving me the opportunity to go out and show everybody else what I'm made of too. And so that builds confidence, and I feel better within myself. I feel like I'm learning. Racing people like Brian as well gives me more confidence, because everybody knows that he's good.
Sure.
So you can judge yourself off some good drivers. So I feel like maybe now people are starting to think, maybe she's pretty good. I don't know that for sure, but I hope that's what they think.
Well, I always think of you, if we're talking first impressions, that would be Formula Atlantic Katherine Legge. So it's been great to see this journey of yours through the North American Open Wheel Feeder Series and in your Champ car and so on. So look, wherever you're gaining momentum career-wise on that arc, it's never a bad thing when it's today. What you don't want to do is say, I remember when I had a lot of career momentum back when George W. Bush was president, or some long time ago standpoint. So let's talk a little bit, Kat, about spending the weekend at Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, Mexico City, as part of the Formula E event there. Thrilling finish to the Formula E event, as we saw with Pascal Wehrlein running out of juice a few feet before the finish line there. But let's talk about this Jaguar I-PACE series as, I guess you could say, the co-act, or the warm-up series, if you want to call it, part of the calendar there. How has that been received from what you've seen, having been part of Formula E in the past, and now I guess 2 races into this new championship? What are your thoughts on where it fits within the Paddock and folks' just general mindset of this electric racing trail that's being blazed?
I would say that it is a support series at this stage, right? We are there to entertain everybody before the main event, which is obviously the Formula E race, but that is only for now. I can see this really taking off, because then you have the open wheel version, and you could have like the touring car version or the GT version, with whatever category it fits in. I'm really not sure where to place it, honestly. And so, I think everybody's been really interested in it. I think people, especially in Mexico, it was a big deal. It was huge. All the fans were really excited for both our race and the Formula E race. But they like seeing action and overtaking and, sorry to say it, but crashing into each other and things like that as well. the people who think that it was a disappointing weekend and got taken out of the race, what have you, that's what the fans kind of loved seeing, was the mortal combat of going door to door with somebody or what have you. So I think that it's going to be really interesting for the fans, especially if you're there and you can see how difficult it is to get a run on somebody, and it's really hard to pass, which makes people take more risks, which ultimately is not good for, Bobby Rahal, because he doesn't want to spend the money on the mirror that I just knocked off trying to overtake somebody and things like that. But no, I think it's great for the fans, it's great for Jaguar, and it's great for the series, because everybody seems to be into it, and they seem to think that it's going to do what Formula E did and grow exponentially. And it certainly isn't hurting or taking away anything from Formula E weekends, because if you go to a race, you want to see different kinds of racing. You go to an IMSA event, you see the Michelin series, and then you see our series. It's no different to anything else. It's like the open wheel version and the closed wheel version. It's kind of fun.
So let's close on this, Kat. So at the finish line, you and your teammate, Mr. Sellers, were separated by less than a half second. What's the actual racing like for those who might have a hard time wrapping their head around the differences in hurling a car that's fairly heavy like this on street tires around I'd say most street courses you're going to head to aren't going to be just laden with grip, but from what you would do either in an Indy car or your GT car or a prototype, what's racing like in this machine, and what are the things you have to do differently, either tire conservation, energy? I know you said you had lots of battery power left, but just curious, what are the things that make this unique or very different from what you do in your normal job?
I think everything. It's a different art form. So it is heavy, as you said, and it is on street tires, and it changes throughout the race. So it's got inherent understeer in the car because it's heavy, but we set it up to oversteer to kind of counteract that. So it's really difficult to be precise, and the smoother you are, the faster you are. So you cannot afford to make any little mistakes. So you're dancing on the edge of ABS. You can't really be in the ABS. You have to dance on getting the edge of it. You have to be smooth as fast, and it's so easy to overdrive. It's almost like you have to back it all the way down and just smooth as fast. And I have Bobby's voice in my head, smooth as fast. And Brian did not let up. There was a lot of pressure from behind, and I knew if I'd made a tiny mistake, he would have capitalized on it. But you can't really get a run, because as soon as you get on the power, it's 100% power is there already. So it's not like you can get a run on anybody. You have to be able to, for example, in the stadium section, you have to be able to get alongside to make a pass stick, or do it in the brake zone. You can't set somebody up like you could in an IMSA car, for example. You can run nose to tail. It's crazy how close you can run without any effect on the car, because there's very little aero. You can be on their bumper, and Brian was literally on my bumper the whole time. I think he did as much as he could to put pressure on me, and I knew he'd be sensible. And luckily, we got a break away from the rest of the field, so we were able to just race each other, and that was important, because I think if it had been anybody else, I may have got a crazy lunge down the inside at some point, or something to make it stick, because that's really the only way you're going to be able to overtake in these.
Pole position, led every lap, won the race. Love the sound of that, Kat. Thanks for spending some time and bringing us inside the still extremely new, just 2 races so far in this Jaguar I-PACE eTrophy series, and you got a little bit of time, but not too much, before you head off to round 3 in Hong Kong. So I know I and many others will be looking forward to see if you and Brian can continue this little clean but fun knockdown drag out fight between teammates.
Thank you. Yep, and it's off to Malaysia for me now for the Asian Le Mans Series round with the FIA Women in Motorsport car. And then, as you said, Hong Kong, then Sebring. It's going to be a busy time of year, but it's awesome. I'm super psyched about this year and just grateful for the opportunities, really.
Well, I'd be a dummy if I let you go before asking about the Le Mans LMP3 entry that we had announced as well. It seems like you're, if you're looking forward to having a rather normal home life between rounds, you're not really doing that for yourself, Mrs. Legge, because you're making sure you're gone all the time. But let's close on this announcement, too. I mean, obviously what you did at the Rolex 24 with the number 57 Meyer Shank Racing Acura NSX GT3 and your awesome teammates there made a lot of news. Seems like, well, I shouldn't say seems like, are you actively pursuing additional drives like you have here coming up in LMP3 and what you just mentioned this weekend with more women, or are they just reaching out to you, realizing that, hey, this is someone we need in the car to do as well as we can?
Yeah, I think, like you said, I have no normal home life at the moment. And what I'm very keen to make sure of is that I put 100% focus and onus on the IMSA and Jaguar opportunities. So I haven't been pursuing anything else because I want to give both those programs my all. I don't want to leave anything on the table. I don't want to take away from that by being tired or not being able to train or anything like that. So these things are kind of finding me. It was important for me to do this last race of the ALMS season with the FIA, Women in Motorsport Commission, because, they have done so much to help women in racing, and it seems to have gained momentum. Now all these opportunities are coming about, and there are so few of us that it's not a surprise that they would ask the same people over and over again, because what we're trying to do is get that pool to be bigger so that there are more female drivers at that level they can pull from. Like I said, I think to you at Daytona, there are only a handful of us, and we have the best ones in the world in the car at Daytona, so we're kind of all following each other around at this stage. I want to give back because of everything they're doing for us. I wanted to do this to help their quest, and I want to support them as much as they've supported us. So it's also really important that I do the right things as well, and that's why I'm doing it. Well,
I love the fact that you're doing your best to help there, also with the knowledge that, well, I guess don't do too good of a job, because then you might be putting yourself out of work. So maybe that's another line to have to try and draw or figure out. But all kidding aside, pretty awesome that you're having this career revolution right now, and not only is it welcome, but fully justified too. Well, Kat, I know you've had some travel fun trying to get home from the Mexico weekend, so thanks for spending some time here in transit.
Thank you for having me on, Marshall, and I will see you in Sebring, no doubt.
Absolutely. And that's episode 4 of Inside the Sports Car Paddock in the books. Thanks again to our pals at Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers for making this possible. And thanks as well to Jeff making time. Seems like he's really enjoying this, so if you have things you'd love to hear us discuss, I do my best as an old former barely adequate race engineer to serve up the questions or fill in a little bit just to help the conversation move along, but by and large, it's the awesome Jeff Braun who's really our source and well of knowledge. So if there are things about the technical side, rules, engineering in general, vehicle dynamics, whatever it might be, strategy, don't be afraid to suggest topics for us to get into, knowing that we're going to try and do this every week. We've got lots of time to get to all kinds of things, so send those ideas in. I know that he loves hearing feedback. I do as well. Thanks again to Ben Keating and Bill Riley for bringing us up to speed and sharing some really cool little facts and pieces of info about their Ford GT program. And then thank you to Kat for helping to close out here and being persistent, even though travel was not her friend, trying to get back home from Mexico City. Definitely came through for us with some great stuff to close. All right, I'm Marshall Pruett. This is the Marshall Pruett Podcast, brought to you by the Justice Brothers and Cooper Tires. Thank you for listening.